Welcome back, dear listener. Or if this is your first time by the fire, welcome. You've arrived at the fireside of the nighttime historian, where the hour grows late, the stars press close, and the past begins to rise like breath in the chill of evening. These are the hours between now and sleep, when the long, flickering stories of history unfold once more by the fireside. Before we begin tonight's journey, I invite you, if you'd like, to leave a comment and share where you're listening from. Whether it's a quiet room in a hushed suburb, a train gliding through open countryside, or a tent pitched beneath stars at a remote campsite. It's always a quiet joy to know where these stories are heard, and by whom. Tonight, we travel to a kingdom that no longer exists, and yet still haunts the maps. A land of blood and brocade, of cathedrals and courtiers, of crowns held aloft and heads laid low. We will walk palace halls, where the sunlight was choreographed, stand among peasants who knelt until they no longer did, and pass through the gates of empire and tradition, only to watch what once seemed immortal begin to crack and fall. This is the story of the Kingdom of France, from its birth in the ashes of the Holy Roman Empire to the mirrored illusions of Versailles, from sacred coronations to the tumbrils of revolution, from kings crowned by bishops to kings judged by men. A story not only of war and pageantry, but of grain and fear, of masks worn too long, and rituals no longer believed. So now, draw your blanket closer, let the day slip into hush, and join us now into the long shadow of the fleur-de-lis, where 1,000 years of glory end with a blade, and the empty space where a throne once stood. It begins not with thunder or flame, but with footsteps softened by marquetry and silence, the hush of slippers on waxed floors, echoing faintly beneath frescoed ceilings. Light pierces the high windows of Versailles, like a divine verdict, scattered across marble and gold, caught in the endless shimmer of mirrors. This is not a home, it is a theatre, and its central actor, the Sun King, has never missed his cue. Here, in the late reign of Louis XIV, the Kingdom of France appears eternal. The air smells of rosewater, candle wax, and the distant rustle of silk. Courtiers glide in orchestrated silence through the hall of mirrors, never daring to let their masks slip. Every glance is a gesture, and every gesture a ritual. The king's rising, le lever du roi, is attended like a sacrament as nobles jostle politely to watch him sit, dress, breathe. It is an empire of performance, choreographed to the hour, and at its center stands Louis, not merely a monarch, but an orbiting sun, around which all others must turn. Versailles itself is more than palace. It is power made visible. Gardens trimmed to geometric perfection, fountains timed to erupt at royal command, doors that open only when the king passes by. Nothing is spontaneous. The world here has been tamed, frozen in gold leaf and symmetry. Even time obeys him. The court rises when he does, eats when he dines, sleeps only after he retires. In this celestial model of monarchy, the king is not a man. He is an idea, divine, untouchable, complete. But behind each polished pane in the hall of mirrors lies a quiet contradiction. The mirrors reflect not what is, but what ought to be. Not truth, but desire. France is rich, yes, but bleeding. Victorious, but brittle. In the salons, poets praise the grandeur of the king's wars, but in the villages beyond the Seine, peasants whisper of famine, of rising bread prices, of sons lost in foreign fields. And still the music plays. Still the fountains dance. Still the king commands the light to fall just so across the polished floors of his kingdom. Even in age, Louis plays his role with devotion. His spine is bent, his limbs stiffened by gout, yet the illusion remains seamless. He dines beneath allegorical paintings that show him as Jupiter, Apollo, Solomon, as judge, God, and muse. The state is him, and he, the state. L'état, c'est moi. But time does not bow, even to the sun. In private, the king coughs blood, his skin grows ashen, and outside the gilded gates, the world begins to whisper a new language, not of obedience, but of rights. Still within the mirrored halls, none dare speak of endings. The chandeliers glitter too brightly, the curtains are too heavy with brocade. The air itself feels enchanted, suspended in amber. To live at Versailles is to live within a spell, and spells, as any court magician will tell you, cannot be broken from within. Those who serve here are too dazzled to see the dust gathering in the corners, the cracks spidering through the marble. They see only the king. They see only the light. And yet, the mirrors see everything. Just beyond the manicured hedges of Versailles, the world changes. The paths are no longer paved with ivory and idealism, but with slush, dung, and frostbitten mud. The perfume of court vanishes, replaced by the heavy breath of horses, cabbage stew, and chimney smoke that clings to stone walls. Paris is only 15 miles away, close enough to hear the toll of its bells on certain clear mornings, and yet it feels like another country entirely. The poor do not see the king as a sun, but as a shadow, cast long across their fields and purses. The baker's wife in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine counts her coins again and again, hoping for a miracle that never arrives. Her eldest son has joined a regiment in Flanders, and her youngest gnaws on crusts. The tax collector visited last week. He left with half a sack of barley and an old copper pan. In Normandy, peasants mutter in their cottages about new tithes, for roads they never use, for wars they never chose. The winter was long, the summer dry. The wheat failed, the prices did not. Whispers fill the streets, whispers of debt, of grain speculation, of noble exemption. In the salons, the rich debate Rousseau and sip imported chocolate. In the countryside, men steal flour from convoys and vanish into the woods. Paris breathes heavier with each passing season. The markets groan with rumour. The inns hum with unease. Even in the wine cellars of the city's heart, among the coopers and dockmen and washerwomen, there is talk that something must change. No one knows what. But everyone knows the cost of standing still. And above it all, looming like a sentinel carved from stone, rises the Bastille. Its towers are not grand like those of the Louvre, nor noble like the steeples of Notre Dame. They are thick, cold, and silent, a fortress prison, a relic of a darker time. Few know who is held within, a pamphleteer perhaps, or a forgotten noble, but it does not matter. The Bastille is no longer just a building. It is a question, a warning, a symbol, and symbols once stirred have a way of catching fire. Still, the carriages roll through the Rue Saint-Honoré, carrying powdered wigs and parasols. The opera opens its velvet doors. The king dines on pheasant and veal behind walls thick enough to muffle history. But Paris is listening. Normandy is listening. Lyon, Toulouse, Brittany, all listening. The whispers are turning into words, the words into grievances, the grievances into chants. Something ancient is stirring beneath the surface, older than kings, older even than crowns. The people are remembering their hunger and their voice. A storm does not announce itself in full when it arrives. It crackles first beneath the skin, a pressure, a silence, a shift in the air. So it is in 1789. The scent of smoke has not yet reached Versailles, but the breeze carries something sharper, a tension, a question, an edge. In the market stalls and taverns, it travels like a ghost between mouths. In the narrow lanes of the Marais, it creeps behind closed shutters and under floorboards. A reckoning is coming, but not yet, not yet. But to understand how it ends, we must return to how it began. The Holy Roman Empire didn't collapse all at once. It loosened, a long unraveling drawn across years and sealed with a signature in ink. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided Charlemagne's great dominion into 3 uneasy kingdoms. From that partition emerged West Francia, unsure of its shape, its name, even its future. The crown that had once crowned Europe now hovered above a lesser throne, still regal in memory, but unsure in hand. There was no sudden birth of France, only a slow fading of memory. The roads the Romans had laid were now buckled by time and disuse. The fields no longer bore the emperor's name. The legions had vanished centuries before, and now even the idea of empire dissolved like mist at sunrise. What remained was land, still fertile in places, but divided by forest, river, hill, and custom. Men ruled these patches of soil by strength of arm and length of bloodline. They called themselves counts, dukes, margraves. Few bothered to ask who reigned above them. In the ruins of Aachene's imperial dreams, churches stood empty of law, their bells echoing across abandoned fields. There were kings, to be sure, but their crowns were made of words and hope. In West Francia, Charles the Bald held court with fragile dignity, but his writ ran thin. The old unity of the Christian empire had frayed to threads. Oaths were sworn and broken. Loyalties were measured in miles and months, not ideals. The shape of Christendom had collapsed inward, and something smaller grew in its place, shaped less by vision than by necessity. Villages fortified themselves with ditches and wooden walls. Monasteries stored not just books, but grain and spears. Raiders came from the north and from the south, Norsemen in longships, Saracens across the Pyrenees. There was no centre to turn to, only the nearest lord and his nearest sword. Justice became a local matter, so did safety and vengeance. In this brittle world, the memory of Charlemagne became a kind of ghost, a name whispered by priests during Mass, or etched into crumbling stone above doorways. The empire had been a cathedral. What remained were broken chapels scattered across the countryside. In the royal courts, what little pageantry remained took on a strangely hollow tone. The rituals of coronation continued, but they felt like theatre played before empty seats. The sacred oils still anointed brows, but fewer and fewer heads bowed in reverence. The king ruled, but only where his feet touched ground. Even within his own lands, castellans and bishops bartered for privilege like merchants. Language shifted, too. Latin receded into cloister and cathedral, while the tongues of the people, crude, coarse, alive, began to find their shape. France was not born here, but something within it stirred, nameless and slow, wrapped in the silence of long winters and the distant clang of iron on stone. And yet, amid the fragmentation, something endured. The idea of rule, though flickering, never fully vanished. even when kings held little more than a handful of manors. They carried with them the weight of inheritance. The title of Rex Francorum, King of the Franks, passed from father to son, even as the realm shrank around them. It was a kind of candle carried through a storm, diminished but lit. The line would not break, not yet. So West Francia lingered, a kingdom more imagined than administered, more prayed for than protected. And as the 9th century gave way to the 10th, the maps of memory became more real than the maps of parchment. Old loyalties turned inward. Castles grew taller. Walls thickened. And beyond the forests, the whispers of unity faded into birdsong and snow. The land ruled first. Before crowns, before charters, before even the shape of France took form, it was the land that chose its masters. Hills and rivers formed the boundaries. Forests made fortresses. Roads were scarce, and justice travelled only as far as a horse could carry it. There were kings, yes, but their names faded as one moved outward from the court, like echoes carried too far across open fields. It was in the manors and motte and bailey strongholds that power pulsed. The throne had receded. In its place stood towers of wood and stone. Each castle stood alone, a hardened shell in a sea of uncertainty. The lord within might swear allegiance to a duke, who in turn pledged himself to a king, but such oaths shifted like snow on the wind. Fealty was given, then taken back. Loyalty depended on harvests, marriages, and sword hands. A man might fight for his liege one season, and raid his lands the next. Power did not descend from the heavens. It rose from the soil, from whatever could be seized and held. In these years, survival became a craft, and the strongest lords were not always the noblest. Some had royal blood, others had bloodied hands. Charters were written in ink, but enforced in iron. A good lord could protect a valley. A great one could hold it for a generation. The rest were remembered only by the scorch marks they left behind. Peasants knew their names, not from coins or proclamations, but from whose soldiers took their grain, and who left the village standing when they passed. Custom became law. What had once been declared in courts and councils was now settled by precedent and pressure. If a village gave grain every harvest, then the tithe became tradition. If a bridge had long belonged to one family, then their toll became truth. Written record meant little. It was memory, local and layered, that shaped the rule of things. Some regions paid tax in salt, others gave sheep. Some refused altogether. There was no France, only Francia, and even that word meant different things in Paris, Bordeaux, or the Breton coast. Castles multiplied. The land bristled with towers. Their stones were quarried from nearby hills, and their halls filled with the smoke of hearth fires and boiled cabbage. These were not the palaces of later centuries. They were grim, pragmatic things, built to endure siege, to intimidate, to mark territory like scars on the landscape. Within their walls, men gathered retainers, hosted feast days, dispensed favors and punishments. The church might still pray for the king, but in practice, the chapel belonged to the lord whose hounds patrolled the yard. Inheritance became the golden thread that tied one century to the next. Sons were raised in armor, daughters weighed in dowry. Some lords gained favor through marriage, others expanded their reach with mercenaries or monks. One built a new church and named a saint as protector. Another forged a deal with Vikings, trading silver for silence. In this patchwork world, cleverness mattered as much as birthright. The map of Francia grew dense with pockets of control, each stitched together with bargains and blades. Above it all, the figure of the king lingered, distant, symbolic, increasingly ceremonial. He might bestow a title or bless a union, but his word alone could not command an army. In many corners of the realm, he was spoken of as one might speak of an old tree in the forest, venerable but far away. Some lords displayed his banner in times of feast, others flew their own. When the messengers came bearing royal writs, they were welcomed or turned away depending on the mood of the gatehouse. And yet, from this confusion, a new kind of order took root, one made of habit, necessity, and proximity. Lords ruled because they were present, because they were seen in the fields at harvest, because they brought justice, however harsh, because their walls held when raiders came. The kingdom had fractured, but it had not fallen into void. It had multiplied. The old unity had vanished. In its place rose hundreds of little sovereignties, each with its own rhythms, banners, and fears. What held it all together was not loyalty to crown, but the relentless rhythm of land and labor, to till, to tithe, to kneel, and then to rise again, if one could. This was the France that would endure for centuries. Not one land, but many. Not one people, but 1,000 customs braided together by duty and inheritance. And somewhere above it all, half remembered in song and sermon, the idea of the king still waited, flickering in parchment, in prayer, and in dreams. In the year 987, the crown passed not with a trumpet's cry, but with a murmur. The great dynasties of Charlemagne had thinned to parchment, their bloodlines tangled in the ambitions of others. The last Carolingian, weary and without sons, faded from the throne like smoke from a spent candle. And in that silence, the magnates of West Francia gathered, cautious, calculating, to choose a new king. They did not reach far. Hugh Capet was no stranger. He held lands already. He was Duke of the Franks, Count of Paris, lay abbot of abbeys older than memory. His family had wealth, walls, and the favor of the bishops. But what made him king was less power than presence. The nobles knew him. They trusted him to rule little, and to disturb even less. His coronation was held in Reims, as tradition demanded. The holy oil touched his brow. The scepter was placed in his hands, and the old chants filled the cathedral. Yet outside those walls, the world did not change. The fields needed ploughing. The grain owed to the local count still waited in barns. In distant Burgundy, no lord stirred from his seat to acknowledge a distant king. In Brittany, the news travelled slowly, if at all. This was not the birth of an empire. It was the planting of a seed, cautious, buried deep, and unsure whether it would ever rise. Hugh ruled without splendor. He built no palaces. He waged no sweeping campaigns. His crown rested more in the minds of monks than in the loyalty of lords. He governed by letter, by envoy, by alliance. And when his son Robert was crowned while Hugh still lived, the first Rex designatus in Frankish memory, it was a gesture of continuity, not confidence. The throne still sat on trembling legs, but it stood. To many he was no more than a figure in ceremony, a name spoken during Mass, a signature affixed to charters. Yet there was something in that constancy. Where others had fought for glory, Hugh endured. Where dynasties rose and fell with war, his strategy was quieter, to root himself in ritual, to entwine his family with the church, to ensure that his line, once placed upon the stone, would not be easily lifted. The Capetian line did not arrive with conquest or coronation fanfare. It arrived like a breath drawn before a long sentence, and in that breath was a promise that royalty could be reborn not through force but through repetition, through marriage, through inheritance, through sacraments whispered again and again until they became unbreakable truths. In the annals of France, Hugh Capet's name does not roar. It lingers, softly, as the first stone set in a long wall, as the taproot of a tree that would one day hold crowns across centuries. The realm he ruled was narrow, but the path he traced would stretch far beyond his lands. In the uncertain dusk of the 10th century, his kingship seemed small, but it endured, and that endurance would become the cornerstone of France itself. The sound of chant that filled Reims' vaulted stone, slow, sacred, enduring. Beneath ribs of Gothic masonry, the chosen king stood barefoot upon chilled flagstones, the air around him thick with incense and ancient syllables. The crown, resting on embroidered velvet, waited not for conquest, but for continuity. This was a coronation crafted from centuries of ritual, a theatre of sacred gestures where each movement carried the weight of bloodlines and scripture. The early Capetian kings understood the stage they had stepped onto. Their realm was narrow, their reach uncertain. But within the cathedral, the world obeyed them. Oil drawn from a vessel guarded for generations touched the forehead with divine promise. Psalms rose to the rafters. Bishops laid hands not just on a man, but on an office shaped by belief. This was no mere succession. It was a reenactment of sanctity, one that made the fragile throne feel older than the stones it stood upon. Around the altar, history hardened into pattern. Sons were crowned during their father's lifetime to ensure no pause in the sacred rhythm. The anointing became a bloodless ceremony of inheritance. Where swords could fail, sacraments endured. The line was reinforced not by might, but by memory, and by parchment inked with oaths, relics set in stone, and blessings repeated like incantations. The king became less a ruler than a symbol, traced over again and again until the shape was permanent. Beyond the cathedral, the duke still governed more land. The counts still gathered larger hosts. Yet the Capetians persisted, unhurried, unshaken. They allied with the church. They married into careful families. They named their sons Robert, Philip, Louis, names that would echo through the generations like the toll of bells across valleys. Theirs was a strategy of duration, measured in rituals rather than campaigns. Time became their fortress. Each coronation reaffirmed the claim. Each chant deepened the groove. What began as custom grew into law, and law into expectation. A king was expected to be crowned in Reims. The holy oil was expected to flow. The pages of charters, filled with prayers and precedents, became a bulwark more difficult to assail than walls of stone. In this quiet repetition, the throne gained mass, not weight that could be lifted, but weight that could not be ignored. The Capetian crown moved slowly through the blood of France, less like a torch passed from hand to hand, and more like a root pushing through soil, drawing strength from the depths of time. And though the sword remained distant, wielded by others, paid by others, the crown became something that could not be stolen. It had been sanctified in ritual, sealed by the rhythm of the altar, and defended by nothing visible except belief. In a realm still torn by feuds and divided by dialects, the Capetians offered something unfamiliar: permanence. Their power did not inspire fear. It evoked recognition. In parchment, in psalm, in the cold air of Reims, the kings became sacred before they became strong. And that sanctity, patient, deliberate, would shape the centuries to come. In the towns where royalty met relic, a new language took shape, one spoken in arches and vaults, in spires that pierced the sky like petitions cast upward. The Gothic cathedral became the kingdom's most enduring gesture. Its walls did not repel enemies, they gathered souls. Within them, geometry turned into theology. Light became a teacher. Stone bore the weight of stories too great for parchment alone. Chartres rose where saints were buried. Rheims echoed with songs sung at coronation. Paris held Notre Dame like a heart clenched in prayer. These were not temples of power in the worldly sense. Their strength lay in awe. Builders chiseled eternity into facades, layering angels above apostles, stories above stars. Glass carried light through color, telling scripture to the illiterate with every beam. A peasant could walk into the nave and stand beneath the ceiling as though standing at the edge of heaven. And when kings appeared beneath those same vaults, they did not seem elevated. They seemed small, and that in itself lent them grandeur. The Capetians understood the value of this scale. Where armies could not reach, ritual could. They anchored their image to the spaces where faith was strongest. The crown was worn before the altar. The name was spoken in the Mass. Coronations were held beside relics and watched by abbots who kept records longer than any chronicler. The king became a participant in sacred architecture, his image set within the narrative arc of salvation itself. Beyond the sanctuaries, the realm expanded along the roads that fed these rising spires. Markets bloomed near pilgrimage stops. Coins changed hands beneath carved tympanums. Monks taught letters in scriptoria beside cloisters lined with herbs. And in these towns, the presence of the king became more common, not as commander, but as patron, observer, receiver of blessing. He was seen at the crossings. He was present where relics drew crowds. He watched as stone was lifted and bells were cast, aligning himself with the rhythm of sacred construction. Notre Dame had not yet become the jewel of Paris, but its shape already promised permanence. The towers, unfinished, still cast long shadows across the Seine, and through its great doors passed men and women from every walk of life, traders, pilgrims, scribes, penitents. Each of them carried their own tongue, their own grievance or prayer, and all of them, at some point, would raise their eyes toward the tracery of light above and find something that felt like order. In a fractured world, these places offered a glimpse of harmony. And within that harmony the king found shelter, not protection, association. The statues carved into the stone told stories of saints, martyrs, angels, beasts, and nestled among them here and there were crowns, not triumphant, reflective, pious. The royal figure in the cathedral was rarely dominant. He knelt, he watched, he gave, and in doing so he absorbed some part of the sanctity etched into the walls around him. The influence of these buildings extended well beyond their foundations. When marriages were arranged, the blessing was sought in stone chapels. When disputes were settled, bishops advised as often as bailiffs. A king who stood beside a relic stood beside time itself, the implication being that his reign too might endure. The Capetians embraced this softly spreading power. They moved with it. They lingered near cathedrals like pilgrims who never quite left. Their sovereignty was reinforced not through domination, but through the quiet repetition of sacred proximity. At the edges of town, where roads diverged into countryside or converged toward market, crosses were raised. Wayside chapels, boundary shrines, worn stones marked the places where decisions were made and paths chosen. These intersections became more than travel points. They became France, a France still unformed in charter or law, but emerging, step by step, blessing by blessing, along the roads where monks walked and masons built, and kings paused to listen. And through it all, the kingdom gathered beneath vault and bell. It was not yet a unity in arms or language, but something deeper had begun, a rhythm of stone and sacred promise, echoing from altar to altar, from crown to prayer. He wore the crown with clean hands. That is how the stories begin. His legacy did not emerge from conquest. It unfolded in example. In an age where monarchs so often ruled by force, Louis IX governed through conscience. He judged beneath an oak tree at Vincennes. He dined simply. He fasted more than he feasted. And when the poor approached, he rose to meet them. For the first time in living memory, the monarch's virtue outlived his victories. Born in 1214, Louis was not raised for glory. He was raised for righteousness. His mother, Blanche of Castile, taught him to fear sin more than death. From her he inherited discipline. From the church he absorbed a vision of kingship steeped in grace. And from the example of Christ he shaped his throne not as a seat of command, but as a platform for moral action. When he came of age, France was already strong, but through Louis it found a soul. He was no stranger to arms. Twice he sailed eastward in crusade, once to Egypt, where he was captured and ransomed, once again, decades later, to the shores of Tunisia, where death would find him amid fever and flies. These ventures were marked less by military triumph than by spiritual insistence. Louis did not fight for territory. He fought for an idea, that kings might serve heaven by leading men into penance and pilgrimage. Even in captivity, he upheld the laws of chivalry and faith with such restraint that his captors spoke of him with reverence. When he returned to France, his justice was sharper than his sword. At home, he reformed the courts. Royal justice began to replace feudal vengeance. He outlawed trials by ordeal. He strengthened the presumption of peace. Those who carried arms without cause faced fines, disfavor, or worse. When the church claimed immunity, Louis negotiated with care. When nobles overreached, he acted not with fury but with method. His reforms did not scream. They settled, over years, over decades. He ruled as though he would be judged, and by that anticipation, he earned legitimacy beyond charter or blood. He built Sainte-Chapelle in the heart of Paris, a jewel of glass and gold crafted to house the crown of thorns. It was not large, it was luminous. The windows carried scripture in light, their hues shifting with the sun like a living gospel. Within its walls, Louis knelt, not in grandeur but in gratitude. His kingship was inseparable from his reverence. His acts of charity, hidden and frequent, became legend before his body turned to dust. When he died in 1270, he was already a relic. Canonized within 30 years, he became St. Louis, not just to France, but to Christendom. His name echoed not only in sermons and statues, but in the legal codes of his successors, who quoted him as authority. Other kings would rule longer, some would rule more widely, but none would wear the crown as lightly, or carry it so far. Even centuries later, his memory clings to the stones of France, in town, squares, and city names, in manuscripts where scribes drew his likeness beneath halos, in Sainte-Chapelle, where the sun still sings through colored glass, and in the idea, now faint, now flickering, that a monarch might rule with humility rather than pride. that justice might flow from piety, that the crown for one shining moment became more than symbol. It became a blessing. It was parchment that would carry its first blows, words before wounds. In the early 13th century, as the Capetian line grew firmer in its rituals and holier in its symbols, its grasp on territory in the West was already loosening. The English crown, once confined to island rule, had crept inland through marriage, legacy, and patient ambition. Dukes of Normandy had become kings across the sea, and those kings, in turn, laid hold to vast stretches of what the Capetians viewed as theirs by right, if not by strength. The tension bled outward from Normandy and Anjou, through Aquitaine, down into Poitou and Gascony. These were not foreign lands. They spoke dialects of French, followed French saints, and traced their charters to kings crowned at Reims. But their lords swore to another sovereign, one whose throne sat across the Channel. In council and chapel, the question of allegiance became tangled beyond easy untying, and where words failed, blades followed. For the Capetians, this challenge was both existential and humiliating. Their realm had grown in sanctity, in ritual, in pageantry, but the map they claimed did not always match the soil they controlled. Kings like Philip Augustus began to press the question with new clarity: who truly held France? The answer came in campaigns, careful at first, then thunderous, castles besieged, ports starved, fortified towns pulled into the fold or left in ruin, and in these moments the sacred crown became once more a helm of war. The English, under Angevin banners, struck back with equal ferocity. What had once been a border hardened into a frontier. Lines were drawn not only across geography, but across identity. Those who had once owed their grain to one lord now found their tithes split by skirmish. Villages burned not for theology or rebellion, but for the shifting fault lines of claim and coin. The people suffered not from empire's fall, but from its multiplication. Even as cathedrals rose and kings knelt before relics, the western lands grew restless. Local barons weighed their loyalties by the season, merchants hedged their allegiances by the harvest, and common folk, the weavers, the shepherds, the masons, learned to mistrust all banners equally. To them, the battle for France was a distant quarrel that kept marching closer. In the heart of Paris, scribes recorded victories in ornate script. In the countryside, peasants buried their dead without names. The Capetians were learning that ritual could sanctify a crown, but it could not hold a frontier. They responded with new kinds of kingship, less reliant on prayer, more rooted in law, land, and levy. Bureaucracy crept in, tax rolls lengthened. The sword and the scroll became equal partners in rule. And still, England remained. Not in every fortress, but in every absence, a rival that shared the bloodline, yet answered to another sky. The struggle would grow sharper in centuries to come. For now it simmered, a line of tension stretching westward from Paris toward the sea, unseen yet unforgotten. The war had not yet begun, but the silence before it had. The century began with a funeral. In 1328, Charles IV, last of the direct Capetian line, was laid to rest, leaving no son to follow him. The bloodline that had ruled France since the crowning of Hugh Capet flickered and faded in his passing. Into the vacuum stepped Philip of Valois, a cousin, chosen by French magnates for his claim through the male line. But across the Channel, another claimant stirred, Edward III of England, whose mother was Charles's sister. His claim moved through the female branch, a path the French rejected. But legitimacy, once fractured, has a way of bleeding outward. In 1337, the war began. It would not end for 116 years. Not in a straight line, nor with clarity. It would move in waves, truces and betrayals, flames and treaties, kings and captives. At first it was a dispute of parchment. Then it became a dispute of cities, then of identity, then of survival. The war outlasted its architects. It burned through their sons, then their grandsons. It carved scars into the countryside deeper than the rivers that fed it. France in the mid-14th century was a tapestry unraveling. The north bent beneath the weight of English chevauchés. Fast, brutal raids meant not to occupy, but to ruin. Crops were trampled, villages were emptied, churches, once the quiet centres of peasant life, were sacked and blackened. The bells fell silent, and in that silence came famine. France bled, not through its armies, but through its soil. At Crécy in 1346, the English archers cut down French cavalry with a storm of arrows that blackened the air. At Poitiers in 1356, a king was taken. Jean II of France, captured and paraded through London, left behind a realm leaderless and humiliated. Ransoms were paid with coin France did not have. Taxes rose, revolts broke. The Jacquerie, a peasant uprising in 1358, was crushed with cruelty. But the fear remained, that the kingdom was rotting from the inside, that no coronation could stitch together what war had torn. Prophets emerged. Some claimed the Virgin had turned her face from France. Others read comets as omens. Dust storms blew through Picardy in midsummer. Monks whispered of judgment. Nobles clung to their lands with growing desperation. Towns fortified walls not against the English, but against hunger and chaos. The idea of France, forged in ritual and sanctity, was beginning to dissolve into something darker, something feral. And yet the war continued. Treaties were signed, then broken. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 ceded massive lands to England, but within a generation it was abandoned. By 1415, the English would return, more vicious, more certain, and at Agincourt they would slaughter thousands of French knights trapped in the mud. The weight of armor became a grave. Heraldry turned to memory. Banners fell into the blood. By the early 15th century, France was fractured in spirit as well as territory. The Burgundians and Armagnacs, rival French factions, tore at each other like wolves. Paris shifted loyalties. Rouen fell. Entire regions became borderlands in the war's new language. Betrayal. The crown sat in Paris, but its authority was thinner than vellum. What held the kingdom together was not will, but exhaustion. And through it all, the war dragged on. Generation after generation. Boys were born and died having never known peace. Fields went unseeded. Cathedrals stood unfinished. Fathers could no longer explain what had started the war, only that it had always been, that it was the air they breathed, the ache in their limbs, the reason the granaries were never full. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes declared that Henry V of England would inherit the French crown. The Dauphin, heir to the Valois line, was disinherited. France in writing belonged to England. But the ink had barely dried before the winds began to shift again, and somewhere, far from court, far from the maps and councils, a girl would begin to hear voices in the silence. But that comes later. The first signs came with the ships. In 1347, Galleys from the east slipped into Marseille, their hulls heavy with spices, silks, and silence. The sailors lay curled in corners, their skin blackened at the joints, their tongues swollen and still. Within days the port city began to choke, not with smoke, but with something older, something for which no name fit. The air thickened, the bells tolled, and then the bells stopped. From Provence to Normandy, from Burgundy to the Breton coast, the plague moved like hunger through a house. It spared no one. Lords died beside their stable boys. Priests collapsed in the aisles of unfinished churches. Mothers buried their children, and then joined them in the same grave. There were not enough hands to dig. In some villages there were no hands left at all. France had known war. It had known famine. But this was different. This was a sickness that breathed. It travelled with wind and rumour. It passed from lips to linens. Entire households vanished between dusk and dawn. The dead were no longer named. They were counted, then burned. And still the counting failed. Some chroniclers wrote of carts filled with corpses lining the cathedral roads, others of pits so wide that birds refused to circle them. The crown could offer no comfort. The war still dragged on. Battles fought in the background of something far older than politics. Kings withdrew to their manors. Nobles sealed their doors. Courts emptied. The bureaucracy of France, already brittle from conflict, began to dissolve beneath the weight of panic. Scrolls went unread. Tax rolls went blank. The parchment of governance curled beside cold ink pots and untouched bread. The church, once the anchor of all things seen and unseen, faltered. Monks died with psalms still on their lips. Bishops refused last rites. Pope Clement VI, cloistered in Avignon, consecrated the Rhône as a mass grave, so the dead might be dumped into running water. His blessings echoed over barges of bodies. Even paradise began to feel distant. In the towns, flagellants whipped themselves in the open square, crying for mercy from a sky gone deaf. In the fields, crosses were raised by those who could no longer read the Gospels. Rumours spread faster than the sickness, that it was a punishment, a sign, a cleansing, that the world was ending, not in fire, but in rot. Some turned to the stars, some turned on their neighbours. Pogroms flared across cities. Scapegoats were hunted in alleys. Humanity, stretched thin, began to split. But amid the horror something else moved, something quieter. The labourers who survived began to ask for coin. The peasants who remained began to walk. From village to village, from lord to lord, they began to choose. France had fewer mouths now, but more questions. Who owns the land if its owners are gone? What law binds a man to a field that grows only grief? The plague loosened the grip of centuries, and underneath it all, the silence endured. The silence of cloisters without voices, of city gates left ajar, of roads where no one rode. A silence heavier than mourning, heavier even than fear. A silence that remade the kingdom's breath. When the plague finally eased, it left behind a France that no longer fit the frame it had known. The dead had vanished, but so had something else. The belief that time moved in one direction. History had cracked. No saint had stopped it. No king had shielded his people. No wall, no relic, no sacrament had held the sickness back. And though the living moved forward, they did so through ashes, through a world rearranged by absence. They called her Jehanne. She had no lineage to speak of, no seal, no horse worth naming. She came from Domremy, a village sown into the hem of France, where saints watched from church walls and cattle outnumbered soldiers. Her hands knew grain, not iron. Her voice was soft until it wasn't. By the time she reached Chinon in 1429, she had crossed a kingdom half in ruin, carrying nothing but a message and the urgency of belief. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited by treaty and surrounded by doubters, expected madness. Instead, he found clarity. She wore a dress of coarse wool. She bowed to no court custom, and yet she spoke of visions, St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret, with a calm that unnerved. She named the signs too quickly. She named the traitors too precisely. Some said sorcery, others said salvation, but all who heard her remembered the weight behind her words. Within months, she rode at the head of an army. Clad in white armor, carrying a banner rather than a blade, she became more than commander. She became consequence. At Orleans, where French resistance was frayed thin, she moved like smoke between camps. She demanded discipline. She ordered confessions. She prayed aloud while archers loosed arrows beside her. And then the siege broke. Orleans held. The impossible had occurred, and Joan, once dismissed as a peasant girl, became the spear point of prophecy. And the victories followed her: Bataille, Troy, Reims. In Reims, the Dauphin was crowned Charles VII. A ritual once soaked in doubt now shimmered with purpose. The cathedral was filled with banners and breath, and at its center stood Joan, not on the altar, but near enough to feel the incense and the weight of history bending. But power moves slowly in corridors. What she achieved in months, politics unraveled in years. Her army shrank. Her council was set aside. Captured near Compiègne in 1430, she was sold to the English. The trial that followed was no trial at all. It was theatre written in advance. Clerics questioned her visions. Nobles sneered at her dress. She defended herself with the same calm she had shown in battle. She spoke plainly. She refused their traps. She invoked the saints. But they had already sharpened the sentence. On May 30th, 1431, she was led into the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19. Bound to a stake and surrounded by clerics and soldiers, she asked for a cross. A soldier fashioned one from 2 sticks and placed it in her hands. When it burned away, they gave her another. Her last word was, Jesus. Witnesses wrote of the smoke curling upward before the flame took her. They wrote of silence, yes, but also of crying, of the English executioner shaken and pale, whispering that he had burned a holy woman. Joan of Arc didn't vanish. In taverns and markets, her name clung to the air. In towns left behind by kings and coin, she became a story passed between breaths. The girl who heard voices, the soldier who rode in white, the one who crowned a king without ever wearing gold. In death, she travelled farther than she had in life, through songs, through sermons, through rumour and vow. And decades later, when the dust of politics had settled and memory had softened into sainthood, she was declared a martyr by the same order that once condemned her. France had no saint like her before, and none since. In the years after Joan's execution, France staggered. The English still held Rouen. Paris remained unstable. The crown of Charles VII rested on a head still shadowed by doubt. But something had changed, not in court, but in the marrow of the realm. The victories she helped ignite had struck deeper than strategy. The spell of inevitability had been broken. Charles, once mocked as the King of Bourges, began to govern. Quietly, relentlessly. He reformed the tax system, professionalized the army, and stripped power from private war bands that had turned the countryside into a patchwork of feuds. No longer did each campaign require the grudging consent of fractious lords. The king could now raise and pay soldiers himself. For the first time in generations, royal command began to mean what it said. By 1436, Paris returned to French hands. In 1450, Normandy followed. 3 years later, the English lost Gascony. In 1453, the last of their strongholds fell at Castillon. The 100 Years' War, a conflict that had devoured generations, did not end in a grand ceremony. There was no sword laid down, no final treaty signed before cheering crowds. It ended in attrition, in exhaustion, in the slow reclaiming of place after place, breath after breath. But when the dust settled, France stood changed. Its borders were scarred, its villages thinned, but its crown had hardened. No longer a symbol passed between bloodlines, it had become something more, a unifying presence above dialects, regions, and rivalries. The king was no longer simply the heir of Hugh Capet or the anointed at Reims. He was the one who had remained, reasserted, rebuilt. A new kind of loyalty took root, not born of ritual or myth, but of memory. The memory of siege, hunger, fire, and the long road back from fracture. Subjects who had once fought under different banners now paid coin into a shared treasury. They followed laws printed in the same script. They buried their dead beneath the same crown emblem carved into stone. There were still fractures, still distant nobles and stubborn cities, but the language of rule had shifted. It no longer spoke only of lineage. It spoke of protection, of continuity, of something beyond person, an idea formed in resistance, tested in plague, and sealed in war. France had bled for its identity. Now it carried the scars openly. By the mid-15th century, the kingdom was no longer merely a map. It had become a memory, a bond forged in siege smoke and battle prayer. It would be challenged again, by reformers, by heretics, by kings who reached too far, but it would not dissolve. It had survived war without end, death in the air, and the burning of its prophet. And from that crucible, the crown emerged, scorched but whole. He came to the throne with a gait that felt more like a dancer's than a general's. Francis I, tall, eloquent, endlessly adorned, entered history not through conquest, but through conversation. His court did not smell of gunpowder. It smelled of vellum, lavender, and the faint heat of candlelit workshops. This was a king who preferred scholars to soldiers, frescoes to feuds, and whose reign would stretch across one of the most dazzling refractions of culture in France's long and battered mirror, though by now mirrors were less metaphor than marvels of glass, imported and polished to perfection. Francis was crowned in 1515, and from the outset he fashioned his reign as an invitation. He invited poets, engineers, painters, sculptors, and from across the Alps he summoned an old man carrying notebooks thick with impossible diagrams and blue-tinted ink. Leonardo da Vinci crossed the mountains with drawings, inventions, and what would become his final brushstrokes. At Amboise, he passed his last years under royal protection, and when he died in 1519, the French court did not bury a foreigner. They buried a flame. Francis declared him the greatest mind who ever lived, and meant it. The king's own hand was not idle. Francis wrote letters in practiced script, signed charters with ornate flourishes, and walked the halls of Fontainebleau as both monarch and muse. He commissioned tapestries that told ancient tales in silken dye, and ordered that his palaces echo with columns and cornices drawn from Roman memory. He saw architecture not merely as shelter, but as proof that France could be beautiful without needing to conquer. That power could rise not just from soil, but from geometry. Fontainebleau swelled into a marble-limbed echo of Renaissance ideals. Its staircases curled like ink on parchment, its gardens unfolded with deliberate elegance. The Galerie François I became a theatre of images, mythic figures painted to seem in motion, gods gazing down through gold, and the king himself rendered like a living statue among them. Here, in this place, the court became a classroom. Scholars debated over Horace and Homer, ambassadors exchanged ideas in 7 languages, musicians played madrigals arranged on pages still wet with composition. The printing press hummed like a second heart to the throne. Francis cultivated not only brilliance, but its preservation. He issued the Ordinance of Montpellier in 1537, a decree that required every book printed in France to be deposited in the royal library. Knowledge was no longer a drifting thing, passed by rumor or song. It was collected, catalogued, remembered. The king who had once led armies into Italy now led parchment into posterity. But beauty, too, demands power. And beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Renaissance, tension stirred like smoke behind silk. The splendor of Francis's reign could not dull the rivalries it inflamed. Across the border, the Habsburgs glowered, and war returned, not as a crusade, but as a contest of empire and ego. Italy became the chessboard. Canons spoke in place of sonnets, and Francis, so fluent in verse, found himself imprisoned after the Battle of Pavia in 1525. The letters ceased. The court waited. He returned, traded for hostages and promises, but something had shifted. The Renaissance in France no longer stood as a pure ascent. It was beauty tempered by cost, gilded scrollwork etched above iron vaults. Patronage became politics. Cultural import became imperial strategy. Art was currency, and painters began to choose allegiance as carefully as generals chose to reign. And yet, the light did not dim. Francis rebuilt. He collected ancient manuscripts from Greece, funded the construction of new colleges, and welcomed Protestant thinkers before religious lines were drawn in blood. For a time, faith and scholarship sat at the same table. For a time, the court was more sanctuary than fortress. For a time, it seemed that the crown could rule by refinement alone. But the world was turning. The press carried more than philosophy. It carried doctrine, and soon those books so carefully gathered would be burned in marketplaces, their printers hunted, their readers tried. France had opened to the world, and through that opening came brilliance, yes, but also fracture. The Renaissance had made the kingdom beautiful. What came next would test whether it could remain whole. The first spark did not catch in France. It crossed the Rhine, tucked in the folds of a pamphlet, ink pressed into parchment, smuggled in satchels, whispered in classrooms, dissected in cafes. Luther had written for Wittenberg, but his fire found dry kindling in Paris, in Lyon, in La Rochelle. By the 1530s, the kingdom was already warm with questions that could not be easily silenced. What is the Church? Who speaks for God? And who precisely gave kings their crowns? The Huguenots did not arrive in armor. They arrived in verse. In Calvin's treatises, in translated psalms, in illegal tracts printed on rough paper and distributed like contraband. For some it was theology. For others, survival. The promise of worship without confession, of community without hierarchy, of faith unmediated by gold and Rome. and in a kingdom where bishops dined in marble halls and abbots held more land than mayors, this new creed took root not among outlaws, but artisans, merchants, scribes. They built not cathedrals, but gatherings, not statues, but songs. At first, the crown watched. Francis I, though a patron of letters, saw the danger behind the ink. His successors watched the sect grow, then fragment. Each splinter made it harder to contain. Geneva became both a refuge and a forge, minting pastors and doctrine that returned to France on foot, in the dark, bearing scripture as weapon. Royal edicts attempted suppression, but paper travels faster than horsemen. Belief leapt borders. One burned pamphlet became 10 rewritten. One preacher arrested gave rise to 3 more, emboldened by absence. By mid-century, the tension no longer simmered. It cracked. Churches were defaced, masses disrupted, altars overturned by hands shaking with faith and fear. The streets of Toulouse saw scripture recited over shattered stained glass. In Nîmes, a crucifix thrown to the ground was lifted again, this time by soldiers. Across the kingdom, belief no longer meant unity, it meant allegiance. And allegiance, when tested, meant arms. The French wars of religion began not with a declaration, but with a decision. That difference was a threat. Catholic leagues gathered in cathedrals to defend the old order. Huguenots met in barns, cellars, fields. The map fractured. Entire cities shifted sides. Nobility, once loyal to lineage, now pledged themselves along lines of doctrine. The House of Guise, blood-bound to the church, marched under banners embroidered with crosses and oaths. The Bourbon princes, Protestant and proud, answered in kind. Castles once filled with Latin chant, now echoed with Geneva psalms. The crown stood between them, unsure whether it ruled a flock or a battlefield. And the people, the butcher's apprentice, the widow with 4 sons, the woman who sold fish at the Seine, they chose because they had to. A neighbor converted, a cousin preached, a church burned. One day the guards searched for heresy, the next for treason. Faith became an axis of suspicion. In the marketplaces, looks grew longer. In the taverns, silence deepened. And when violence came, it came with conviction, not as rage, but as righteousness. What had begun as a question was now a fracture. And from that fracture bled a new kind of fire, not the fire of revelation, but of vengeance. Not light, heat. By the 1560s, France could no longer pretend that theology lived in books alone. It lived in broken windows, in sword hilts, in children orphaned beneath the walls of Orleans. The kingdom, so recently radiant with ink and architecture, now heard the voice of God shouted through cannon smoke and cavalry charge. There would be edicts, there would be truces, but faith once split cannot be sown by parchment. France had opened its gates to thought, and in that opening had invited a storm. One side claimed Rome, the other, Scripture. And somewhere between them, the idea of mercy was crushed beneath the weight of certainty. The wedding was meant to bind the nation back together. In the summer of 1572, the bells of Notre Dame rang out over a jubilant Paris. Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother and tactician in widow's black, had orchestrated a union between her Catholic daughter Marguerite and the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre. It was a gesture of peace after years of religious war, a fragile bridge built over blood. But beneath the garlands and incense, blades were already being whetted. For days the capital had filled with guests, nobles from the provinces, envoys from across Europe, and Huguenots by the thousands. They walked the same alleys as the Parisian guildsmen who whispered of heresy and betrayal. The city grew warm with summer heat and tension. Sermons darkened, broadsheets spread rumors. Every toast was a test, every glance a calculation. Then came the shot. On August 22nd, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Huguenot leader, was nearly assassinated while walking back to his lodgings. An arquebus ball shattered his hand. The king visited him. So did Catherine. Apologies were offered, promises made. But behind the palace doors, fear bloomed like rot. The Queen Mother feared reprisal. The king feared insurrection. And someone, history is still not certain who, gave consent to murder. Before dawn, on August 24th, Paris held its breath on the feast of Saint Bartholomew. Guards moved first on Coligny. Dragged from his bed, he was stabbed, thrown from a window, and beheaded. His corpse was paraded through the streets, head dangling from a pike. Then came the signal. Church bells rang, not for prayer but for slaughter. Across the city, doors were kicked in. Huguenots dragged from beds, stabbed in doorways, butchered in courtyards. Women begged, children cried. Blood ran in the gutters of Paris while banners of fleur-de-lis still fluttered above. For 3 days, the killing did not stop. Houses burned, bodies choked the Seine. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Priests gave absolution before the blade fell. Soldiers held torches with one hand and sabers with the other. The massacre spilled beyond the capital. Towns across the realm followed suit. Orléans, Lyon, Toulouse. The message was heard, even when no orders were given. As many as 10,000 died. Some say more, some say fewer, but the number does not matter. The wound was total. The illusion of reconciliation had collapsed. The crown was no longer a referee between factions. It had become a faction itself. And in the royal palace, the new Protestant king by marriage, Henry of Navarre, was spared only because he converted. On paper, under threat. His eyes watched Paris burn from behind stained glass. He would remember. France had once been torn by questions of doctrine. Now it was haunted by something colder. Betrayal not of belief, but of trust. The wedding veil had hidden a knife. The bells had sung a lie. From this moment forward, every gesture of peace would carry the shadow of a blade. The kingdom could no longer bleed without memory. He had seen too much blood to believe it sacred. Henry of Navarre had survived the wedding that turned to slaughter. He had knelt before altars he did not believe in, spoken creeds to stay alive, smiled beneath chandeliers as Paris wept. But when the time came to claim the crown, after the death of kings and brothers and sons, he did not come as prophet or martyr. He came as a man who had learned that France would never kneel all in one direction. In 1589, with the death of Henry III and the Valois line, the throne passed, by blood and law, to the Huguenot prince from the south. But a Protestant king in a Catholic kingdom could not reign by inheritance alone. The gates of Paris remained shut to him. Bishops thundered from pulpits. Spanish gold flowed into the hands of the League. The war that had long devoured the countryside now narrowed into a single, deadly standoff. Belief against belonging. Henry waited. He fought. And then he courted. And then, in 1593, he walked into the cathedral and converted. Paris is worth a mass, he is said to have declared, and whether he spoke it aloud, or only thought it, the meaning resounded. The crown would not be won through purity. It would be worn through pragmatism. His coronation at Chartres in 1594 did not erase the decades of war. It did not unburn the churches or revive the children who had vanished beneath soldiers' boots. But it began something else. Not healing exactly, but the possibility of breath. And from that breath came parchment. In 1598, the Edict of Nantes was signed, a document that did not bless the heretic, but tolerated him, that did not erase the past, but built a fence around it, that allowed Protestants to live, worship, and trade in a realm still draped in Catholic rites. The edict was not universal. It carved exceptions. It created grudges. But it marked a pivot, away from certainty toward coexistence. Henry did not ask his kingdom to agree. He asked it to endure. His government began to stitch together again. Roads rebuilt, coins revalued, tax rolls balanced with something resembling fairness. The crown was no longer a torch held aloft. It was a balance, shaky, scarred, but upright. And yet not all wounds forget. In the south, suspicion festered. In the capital, old loyalties burned beneath velvet. The king travelled constantly, through towns that still hung his portrait beside crucifixes, and those that whispered his name with clenched teeth. He dined with bishops. He met with merchants. He buried swords in soil that had known too many banners. His presence became policy. His moderation, a kind of revolution. Henry IV ruled not by divine right, but by daily reassurance. And perhaps that is why, in 1610, when he was stabbed in his carriage by a zealot, the kingdom did not fall. It reeled, but did not rupture. France had learned something in the fire. It had learned that peace need not arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it wears a coat, speaks 3 languages, changes its mind, and signs a paper so that the next child born might not have to choose sides. This was not triumph. It was survival. And in the soft breath between wars, France exhaled, briefly, barely, as a kingdom that had chosen to remain whole. They did not crown the cardinal, but France bowed to him nonetheless. In the long corridors of the Louvre, between velvet-draped councils and scrolls weighted with wax, the pulse of power shifted, slow, precise, relentless. Louis XIII was king by blood, but Cardinal Richelieu governed by design. His rule did not echo with drums or fanfare. It ticked, like a clock embedded in the walls of court, gears of legislation, pulleys of surveillance, the rhythm of an emerging machine masked beneath vestments and incense. France, in 1624, was not yet the polished jewel it would pretend to be. It was fissured, nobles who ruled their provinces like private kingdoms, parlements that balked at royal edicts, cities that remembered old privileges too fondly. The crown shimmered, but it wobbled. Richelieu understood this fragility not as failure, but as opportunity. Where others sought loyalty, he sought structure. He silenced rebellion not with swordplay, but with parchment and tax rolls. The administrative state, slow to birth, swift to grow, began to take shape beneath his hand. Governors were replaced with intendants. Local allegiances dissolved beneath seal-stamped instructions sent from Paris. Each dispatch, a tether. Each signature, a pin driven into the map. He moved with the precision of a man who believed France itself could be rewritten, not with poetry, but with policy. The nobility bristled at the change. Duels were outlawed, fortresses razed, feudal privileges stripped in increments like varnish peeled from rotting wood. Richelieu knew how to wait. He let the outcry echo through the salons, then answered with ledgers. The state had no patience for sentiment, only solvency, only control. In La Rochelle, a Protestant stronghold that resisted both church and crown, He laid siege not just with troops but with calculations. Grain withheld, routes blocked, allies outmaneuvered. When the walls fell, it was not thunder that marked their collapse. It was hunger. The king remained visible, of course. Portraits framed Louis XIII in ermine and scepter. But behind the curtains, it was Richelieu who choreographed the state. Ministries multiplied. Censors worked by lamplight. Couriers moved faster. Nothing was untouched. Not coinage, not conscription, not the shape of borders along the Pyrenees. He did not seek applause. He demanded outcomes. A play performed flawlessly regardless of whether the audience approved. And yet he knew performance mattered. Rituals continued. Coronations, processions, masses. But each was now orchestrated to support the state's spine. Where once kings ruled by charisma, France now moved according to draft and decree. Opposition found itself silenced by exile, taxed into compliance, or buried beneath the folds of administrative precision. The sword had not vanished. It had been sheathed beneath velvet and lined with law. Richelieu constructed a France that could outlive personalities, a France that required obedience not to the man, but to the mechanism he had assembled. Even his death in 1642 did not unmake it. The gears turned on. Ministers trained in his likeness, councils conducted in his cadence. The king who followed would be a boy, and yet the machine did not stop. Louis XIII's reign is remembered for its stillness, but that is misread. Beneath the calm surface ran veins of command, censuses, secret police, official language policies. The realm was no longer a collection of fiefs, but a single body, pulsing under Richelieu's hand. It did not yet shine. It did not yet dance. But it stood balanced, exquisitely so, between force and illusion. And within that balance, France became more than inheritance. It became instruction, a set of methods, a choreography of state. It is easy to forget. In the shadow of the Sun King, that absolutism was not born in golden mirrors or the rustle of brocade. It began here, in silence broken only by the scratching of pens, in policy, not passion, in a cardinal's quiet conviction that power should be neither begged nor borrowed, only arranged. He was crowned while still a child, lifted by hands not his own, stared at by courtiers who measured futures in inches of silk. In 1643, Louis XIV became king, but it would be years before the kingdom knelt without conditions. At first, he was more symbol than sovereign. The decisions were made by his mother, Anne of Austria, and Cardinal Mazarin. Yet even as a boy, Louis watched, and what he saw, or rather what he learned to fear, would shape the crown forever. The court was not safe. The court was never silent. Between 1648 and 1653, Paris turned on itself. The Fronde, part uprising, part vendetta, part aristocratic tantrum, shattered the illusion of royal invulnerability. Nobles raised armies, judges defied edicts, children threw stones at royal carriages. The king fled his own capital more than once, waking to doors broken open, whispers in the halls, sabres gleaming too close to his chamber. The memory of those nights would never leave him. He was 7 when the city taught him that power, if not absolute, was precarious, and Louis, boy or not, refused to be precarious ever again. He grew into a monarch with a spine forged from that early disorder. By the time Mazarin died in 1661, Louis had resolved that no minister would eclipse him. No noble would divide him. No city would forget who commanded its streets. He summoned his council. He gave his orders. He would rule alone. But he did not govern like his predecessors. He did not wait behind paper walls. He choreographed. Every motion, every hour, every step along a colonnade became part of the state's design. He rose at dawn before a circle of nobles. He dressed in ceremony. He dined beneath ceilings that bore his likeness among the gods. France would not simply obey him, it would orbit him. Versailles became the setting, but Louis was always the actor. The palace did not exist to house the court, it existed to transform it. No one ruled from its galleries but him. No one whispered in its mirrors without his reflection listening. Nobles were drawn in by invitation, then softened by comfort and surveillance. Rivalries were wrapped in etiquette, conspiracies drowned in luxury. The king required loyalty, but he secured it through routine. Swords grew dusty, voices grew careful, each rank defined by its proximity to the monarch's shadow. He spoke often of light as something to be arranged, like rooms or gardens. It moved through Versailles by design, not metaphor. Gardens arranged to catch the sun at its apex. Halls designed to pull dawn through windows at precise angles. Time itself began to mirror his will, days arranged to match his schedule, rituals unfolding with the weight of liturgy. The monarch had become a calendar, a center of gravity. France followed. Ministers served at his pleasure. Artists painted to glorify his reign. Colonies were mapped, wars declared, alliances forged, all beneath his unblinking gaze. When victories came, they were his. When defeats came, he absorbed them in silence and rode forward. But beneath the gilded symmetry, something else stirred. The cost of orbiting the sun is heat. Distance meant irrelevance. Closeness required caution. Those who served too near learned to sweat beneath his stare. Nobles performed loyalty like dance. Ambition became a game of angles, not ideas. Outside Versailles, the provinces watched and waited, reverent but uncertain. The king had ended the turbulence of his youth. He had stilled the court. He had mastered the realm. But in doing so, he had made France singular. Every breath of state passed through one mouth, and in that silence, greatness gleamed, and fragility grew. Versailles was not a palace. It was a stage, scripted, rehearsed, and brilliantly lit. Every gallery, every window, every carpeted stair was part of a living set, and at the center stood Louis XIV, whose life became the model for his kingdom. The court moved because he moved. It woke when he rose. It dined when he was served. Even boredom was orchestrated, delayed, redirected, wrapped in layers of velvet etiquette. Time no longer belonged to God. It belonged to the king. He had turned existence into ceremony. The morning lever, the royal waking, involved over 100 witnesses, nobles, chamberlains, bishops, valets, each with an assigned place and a carefully timed gesture. One passed him his stockings, another held a mirror, a third opened the shutters to admit light in sequence. To attend was an honor. To be dismissed was a warning. There were no private moments, only degrees of distance. And through these motions, the state communicated what no edict could. The king was France, and France was watching. Versailles had no defensive walls. It did not need them. Its defenses were invitation and inertia. Nobles who might have plotted in forests now pleaded for chamber access. Daughters were married with choreography in mind. Sons were positioned by page rank and favored glances. There were gardens for walking, fountains for listening, salons for murmuring opinions dressed as compliments. One did not shout at Versailles, One waited for their turn to be seen, and prayed that the glance would linger. Outside, the kingdom stretched in all directions, but inside the palace, the world folded inward. News arrived in curated bursts, victories immortalized in fresco, maps redrawn to flatter, deficits softened in poetry. Ministers navigated the corridors as dancers through a hall, stepping carefully over protocol and scent. Even silence became a tool, a paused reply, a slow blink, a missing invitation. Ambition here required fluency in posture and tone, in knowing when to kneel and when to vanish. The Sun King understood power not as command, but as condition. He became a climate. Warmth could promote, shade could erase. Favor was not earned, but absorbed, and lost just as easily. Painters captured him in mythic robes, among Roman gods and allegorical virtues. He dressed to reflect the state's magnificence: gold thread, white gloves, wigs styled like sculpture. But beneath it all was calculation. Every detail served the system. Even his walk through the Hall of Mirrors became a kind of law, a ritual of presence so refined it replaced policy. By the 1670s, France was no longer simply ruled. It was choreographed. The ministries expanded to match the ritual. Finances streamlined for court needs. Military campaigns timed to royal festivals. Tax collection adjusted to avoid discomfort at seasonal events. Language, too, became tighter. The French tongue was cleaned of provincial clutter, smoothed into grammar books, and exported across Europe as the language of diplomacy. Versailles was not only beautiful, it was contagious. And yet the grandeur hid a slow stiffness. Behind the brocade walls, flexibility narrowed. Few disagreed openly, fewer innovated. To contradict was to risk exile, not always formal, sometimes social. Ministers were replaced not for failure, but for failing to impress. Even excellence had to sparkle, even loyalty had to perform. Over time, the courtiers grew exquisite and brittle, but the illusion held. Visitors from Spain, England, the Empire returned dazzled, reporting a monarchy of such polish and precision that its glory seemed eternal. They did not see the accounts locked away in bureaus. They did not feel the weight of gowns stitched to please one gaze. They did not hear the prayers whispered not in devotion, but in hunger, from villages past the court's golden reach. Louis XIV had succeeded. He had silenced the Fronde. He had subdued the nobles. He had built a state around his body and made that body immortal in image and motion. But the orbit was tight, the radiance blinding. And in the stillness beneath his throne, the air grew heavy. It glittered too brightly to notice the dark. Versailles still shimmered with candlelit tableau and choreographed grace, but far beyond its mirrors, the cost was beginning to bleed through. Louis XIV, at the height of his splendor, commanded a kingdom that had become gold-leafed at the edges and hollow beneath. His wars, endless and consuming, had drained the treasury. His court, vast and hungry, devoured coin and grain alike. What could not be paid in silver was paid in silence. The countryside bore it first. Taxes multiplied, no longer levied with negotiation but dictated from a desk in Paris. The peasantry, already bent by poor harvests, now felt the hand of Versailles, not as guidance, but as weight. Bread thinned, debts lengthened, and when the coffers ran dry, the crown turned to exile what it could no longer afford to accommodate. In 1685, the Edict of Nantes was revoked. The royal ink dried on a document that silenced nearly a century of uneasy peace. Protestant churches were shuttered. Pastors were exiled or imprisoned. Schools were closed, children taken, marriages annulled by decree. The Huguenots, once tolerated if not embraced, were given a simple choice: conversion or flight. Many chose flight, carrying their skills, crafts, and language to England, Prussia, the Netherlands, places that welcomed what France had refused to see, their worth. Official portraits still showed Louis as Solomon or Caesar, wrapped in allegory and order. The fountains at Versailles still leapt on schedule. Music still drifted through salons lined with lacquer and pearl. But beneath the orchestrated pageantry, something was breaking. The state had chosen purity over cohesion, and in doing so, lost not just citizens, but balance. Entire industries shrank. Ports grew quieter. Provinces once vibrant with trade slowed into silence. And still, the performance continued. The wars did not stop. From the Low Countries to the Pyrenees, Louis poured men and coin into theatres of conflict, meant to preserve his vision of sovereignty. The victories were costly, the defeats unspeakable. Each campaign fed the illusion of strength, even as the kingdom's arteries narrowed. By the 1690s, famine had returned, not as a spectre, but as a fact. Tens of thousands died in winters that did not end. Villages emptied. Wells froze. The poor gathered beneath cathedral eaves, praying to saints whose names they could barely pronounce, while Versailles debated the order of court dances and floral arrangements. The palace did not dim. That was its danger. The harder the strain became, the more rigorously the illusion was enforced. Every crack was covered in gold, every silence filled with string music. The Sun King could not waver. He was no longer a man. He was France, and France, to survive, had to appear eternal. Yet those closest to the court began to feel the pressure. Intendants found resistance where there had once been reverence. Priests, once confident, now preached to shrinking congregations. Merchants watched their ledgers curl inward. The centre held, barely, but only because the walls had been taught not to speak. And when dissent did rise, it was met not with debate, but with velvet gloves stiffened by iron. Surveillance expanded, censorship thickened, punishments quieted the rest. Louis aged. The brilliance of his reign remained, but its lustre dulled with each toll of the court bell. He buried heirs, generals, ministers. The court, once vivid with youth and intrigue, grew ceremonial and brittle. Conversations turned cautious. Mourning became routine. Outside, the people endured what they could. Inside, the king prayed, daily, devoutly, and did not flinch. And yet, for all the stillness, the cracks widened. Beneath the polished floors of Versailles, the floorboards creaked. Beneath the tapestries, the walls cooled. And far beyond its gates a question began to form, too slow to shout, too dangerous to name. The kingdom had never looked more beautiful, and never felt more tired. The hallways of Versailles still glittered, but the air had changed. Courtiers passed beneath chandeliers that no longer cast light. They diffused it, softening every edge into indulgent haze. Louis XV had inherited a kingdom wrapped in satin, perfumed in memory, but behind the drapery the timbers creaked. The boy who was crowned at 5 grew into a man whose presence wavered between apathy and appetite. He ruled from within layers of velvet, watching ministers like marionettes, pulling strings when it pleased him, and leaving the stage dark when it did not. Gone was the sacred gravity of his great-grandfather. Louis XIV had made the monarchy theatrical. Louis XV made it faint. Foreign ambassadors waited days for an audience, only to be received in silence or dismissed by a yawn. He drifted through his reign as through a masked ball, glimpses of brilliance lost in corridors of tedium. Affairs of state turned sluggish. Edicts moved like syrup through bureaucratic pipes. The court's mirrors no longer reflected grandeur. They exaggerated its absence. And still, the wine was poured. The orchestras played. The perfume masked everything, even rot. Colonial misadventure scattered French gold across oceans. Canada, India, Senegal, promises drawn on foreign coasts and repaid in blood or loss. The 7 Years' War, between the years 1756 to 1763, should have ended with glory. It ended with cessions, debts, and silence. French fleets smouldered in far harbours. Their captains drank quietly in exile. And in Paris, the royal ministers recalculated grain reserves while the king retired to his pavilions at Bellevue. There, among silk cushions and curated gardens, he escaped into pleasures small and narrowing. A new mistress, a private hunt, a sculpture gifted by a duchess who had already forgotten his name. Among the people, reverence thinned. The old fables, of king as father, of crown as blessing, withered. In the provinces, tax burdens deepened like ruts in the road. Nobles held their exemptions like medals. Peasants sold their spoons. Grain prices rose. Patience fell. And in the capital the air shifted, less reverent, more curious. Why, asked pamphleteers, did virtue wear brocade while wisdom wrote in attic rooms? Why did the state spend 30,000 livres on porcelain, while bread lines curled around the baker's door? The questions found no answer in council. Louis, withdrawn, preferred the company of parlour card tables to parliaments. His reign trickled on, accumulating banquets instead of victories, lace instead of laurels. He was not hated, not yet. He was forgotten in moments of urgency, remembered only in satire. Plays began to mock court fashion. Caricatures slipped from presses with crooked crowns and slackened sceptres. A king who once had all eyes found himself watched less with awe than with amusement. France still bowed, but the gestures grew automatic. No fire had yet been lit, but the velvet was drying, the dust thickening in folds. A monarchy still stood, exquisite, choreographed, numb. Its strength no longer rested in sanctity or vision, only in the heaviness of tradition. Even now, in the gilded salons of Versailles, the upholstery bore the marks of a long sit. Silk faded where ministers had waited. Gold leaf flaked beneath fingers that clutched scrolls of delay. The monarchy had not collapsed, but it had paused, mid-movement, mid-decree, mid-century. And in that pause, a generation inhaled the perfume of the old world, not yet knowing it would be their last. The palace still stood, but elsewhere, another kind of power was gathering, quieter than drums, sharper than swords. It flickered in candlelit salons, passed hand to hand in stitched pamphlets, whispered in the antechambers of academies and the back rooms of cafes. Here, the monarchy was not crowned, it was questioned, and for the first time in centuries, ink held more potential than oil. The philosophes were not revolutionaries, not yet. They were thinkers, playwrights, naturalists, skeptics, part of a world that lived beneath the ceiling of absolutism but found air elsewhere. Voltaire fired the first flashes, his wit sharpened against clerics and censors alike. He skewered hypocrisy with elegance and laced sarcasm with reason. Exiled, applauded, feared and read. His pen moved faster than royal decree. Beside him, Montesquieu reimagined government as a balancing act of power and principle, and Rousseau, breathless, prophetic, looked to nature and found freedom where tradition had chained the soul. The ideas didn't march, they would rather gather. In Paris, the salon became a crucible. Madame Geoffrin, Madame de Staël, Madame du Deffand. Their drawing rooms offered velvet chairs and open discourse. Men of letters debated men of court, and sometimes won. Candles burned late. Diderot's encyclopédie expanded with every volume, a universe of knowledge that grew beneath the nose of censorship. It did not shout, it accumulated. Bit by bit, the world it described became more vivid than the one Versailles insisted was real. Even those within the palace walls began to feel the shift. Pages read Rousseau in secret. Princes scribbled opinions in margins. Ministers found themselves cited less than printers. The church, long a pillar of certainty, began to tremble beneath questions it could no longer dismiss. Why must kings rule by birth? Why should truth depend on tradition? What was justice, if not written for all? These were not threats yet. They were seeds. But the soil had changed. It was looser. It accepted new roots. The monarchy, once armored in sanctity, now stood in a garden of ideas it could neither prune nor direct. It responded with gestures, tighter control of the presses, exiles, symbolic trials. But these only sharpened the point. A man expelled for writing often sold more copies than one who stayed. A band tract once whispered became a bonfire in print. And still the questions came, in volumes and treatises, in satire and allegory, in diagrams and dialogues and bold prefaces that bowed to no crown. This was not rebellion, it was rehearsal, a dress fitting for another kind of nation. Philosophers envisioned states guided by contract, not blood. Educators drew curricula not from catechism, but from curiosity. The mind, long forced to bend to altar and throne, now stood upright, and though most thinkers still nodded to Louis and to God, the nod was lighter, less complete. Outside the city, the countryside slept beneath old burdens. Tithes remained, exemptions held, but in cities something shifted in posture. A man who once tipped his hat to the nobility now read Voltaire before sleep. A printer's son debated natural rights in a cellar warmed by rhetoric alone. The world did not explode. It softened, and in that softening, it moved. The crown remained untouched, but its shadow no longer fell across every table. There were places where light, not divine but intellectual, reached without permission. And in that glow, monarchy began to look not eternal, but optional. The flowers still bloomed at Versailles, but in the provinces the soil cracked. Seasons came and went with fewer harvests to mark their passing. What once fed a household now barely filled a sack. In the Loire Valley, wheat stood thin and brittle. In Burgundy, rain drowned the barley before it ripened. In the mountains of Auvergne, there were no harvests at all, only moss boiled in broth, bark stripped from trees when the roots froze too deep to dig. France was rich on paper. Its exports gleamed, its court consumed. But the people bent low, beneath a weight that neither ledger nor mirror could measure. The peasantry, 9 out of every 10, bore the kingdom on their shoulders, and in return they received ash, brine, and silence. Taxes came in layers, to the crown, to the church, to the seigneur whose dogs wore finer coats than the tenants' children. Each collector arrived with parchment and demands. Few arrived with relief. Tithes had once been religious obligations. Now they were rituals of extraction. The local abbé might preach of virtue on Sunday, but his men weighed the granaries with cold hands on Monday. Salt, required by law, was taxed at rates that turned necessity into punishment. To bake bread without permission was a crime. To complain aloud was worse. So the villagers muttered, in corners, in cellars, over weak soup and strong memory. There were years when the hunger softened, when the vines yielded well, when the chestnuts came early, when the price of rye held steady. But there were more years when the children stopped growing, when shoes were passed between siblings like heirlooms, when skin broke from cold long before spring arrived. And yet, the letters from Paris spoke of bulls and fountains and court perfumers experimenting with saffron. In Limousin, an entire hamlet vanished between tax rolls. In Picardy, a baker was stoned after raising prices to survive. The anger did not come in riots, not yet. It came in absences, fields abandoned, markets half empty, coins melted into spoons and lost to pawnbrokers. Mothers who had once lit candles now bartered for flour with prayer alone. And still, Versailles received the tithe. The king did not taste the bitterness, but his ministers read reports, crop surveys, parish death lists, census gaps. They answered with orders, tariffs, investigations. But no one came to fix the roof of the mill. No one came to find the vanished midwife. They sent new rules. They sent new taxes. The silence deepened. Between the books of the Enlightenment and the golden cutlery of the court lay a country stretched too thin. Philosophers dreamed of equality, while labourers watched their wives waste away. Priests blessed children who would not live to walk. Noblemen debated debt in silk-draped rooms, while peasants stitched breeches with hay twine. The distance between capital and field had grown so wide that even the roads, rutted, frost-heaved, impassable in rain, began to feel like borders. France had become two nations. One glittered, one withered. One read pamphlets by candlelight, the other burned furniture for heat. One worried about inheritance law, the other worried if there would be bread come April. The people still bowed, but now they bowed to survive. Reverence no longer sat beside hunger, only endurance. No decrees announced this fracture, no trumpet declared the moment when patience wore out. But it was happening, in the way a man tightened his belt with a string, in the way an old woman stopped going to mass because her shoes had no sole, in the way a village forgot the name of the seigneur's grandfather. What once was order had become burden, what once was burden had become injury, and what once was injury now waited. She arrived with silk and ceremony, 15 years old, Austrian, luminous, and already mistrusted. The marriage was political, as all royal unions were, but in Marie Antoinette the people found not a queen, but a question. She came bearing perfumes, porcelain, and no French blood. The daughter of Maria Theresa, Empress of the Habsburgs. She was crowned with suspicion long before the first jewels touched her brow. Versailles welcomed her with rehearsed affection. The court gossiped before it bowed. Her smile, bright and practiced, was passed from ambassador to painter to playwright. She danced, she laughed, she mispronounced. She did not speak the language of hunger, nor did she need to. At first, they forgave her youth. But France was aging fast, and its patience thinned with each rose-gilded carriage wheel that rolled through its hungry villages. Inside the palace, she sought escape from scrutiny, and found it in artifice. She built her own world within Versailles, the Petit Trianon, where protocol relaxed, where laughter flowed freer, where courtiers dressed as shepherds and milkmaids without ever touching dirt. There was theatre, harp music, straw hats designed by milliners who had never seen a field. She did not invent decadence, she inherited it. But she played her role too well, and the play was no longer fashionable. The rumours began softly. A necklace here, a masked ball there, a glance too long, a debt unpaid. Then came the pamphlets, sharp, vulgar, and unstoppably wide. They gave her 1,000 lovers, none of them the king. They counted her gowns, her jewels, her imagined escapades with grooms and guards. They made her French by scandal, if not by origin, and the more she denied, the more they believed. Truth, once doubted, lost its shape. Louis XVI, heavy with indecision, offered no refuge. He loved her, perhaps, but he could not protect her from being seen, and what they saw they resented. While wheat spoiled in the ports and taxmen circled like crows, the Queen was said to sip rose water and ignore reality. She did not say, "Let them eat cake," but the silence from her salon was too long, and the words were written for her anyway. She was not unkind. She was not cruel. But she was visible, too visible, at the very moment the monarchy needed to vanish into humility. She adored fashion while France tore old dresses into rags. She redecorated as roofs collapsed. She sent gifts across Europe as local markets crumbled. Her gestures, even the generous ones, arrived painted in gold leaf. No longer a sovereign, she became a silhouette, used, blamed, mocked. The people's anger needed a face. Hers was porcelain and easy to break. As the 1780s curled toward crisis, the court tried to restore order. There were reforms, too late. There were advisers, too cautious. And there was the Queen, increasingly isolated, not by power, but by perception. She stayed at Trianon while the ground beneath the monarchy shifted. She played with her children in manicured gardens as cobblestones cracked beneath carriage wheels. She composed letters. She wore pastels. And the sound from beyond the hedges grew sharper. They called her l'Autrichienne, the foreigner, the spendthrift, the harlot. None of it was true in full, but it didn't have to be. The monarchy had stopped being a government. It had become a stage, and Marie Antoinette, dressed for the final act, could no longer step off of it. Every gesture was interpreted, every absence magnified. In a kingdom teetering toward reckoning, she moved with a grace that looked like blindness. And when the people looked to the palace, they no longer saw a queen. They saw distance. They saw powdered wigs through fog. They saw a door that would never open from the inside. They did not want her crown. They wanted her absence. The spell, that long enchantment of monarchy as divinely adorned, was thinning to its final threads. And her silhouette, once luminous in the candlelight of coronation, now stood against a sky-gathering storm. The Bastille did not fall like a palace. It cracked, like old stone under weight. At dawn on July 14th, 1789, it was still just a fortress, brooding, obsolete, and barely staffed. By dusk, it had become the edge of something new. The crowd that gathered outside was not an army. They were printers, fishmongers, journeymen, coopers, barefoot boys with iron rods and rusted blades. No uniforms, no order. Just a tide with knives, restless, rising, impossible to turn. The day began with panic. Rumours of troops outside Paris. Rumours of bread being hoarded. Rumours that the National Assembly would be dissolved. That the king would act. that he already had. The crowd moved first to the Hôtel des Invalides, seized thousands of muskets, but found no powder. The Bastille had powder, the Bastille had cannons, the Bastille had gates, and behind them, a symbol too swollen to survive. Inside, Governor Delaunay hesitated. His fortress held only a few dozen guards and fewer provisions. He offered delay, words, warning shots, but the square outside was no longer a place for words. Cannon fire cracked. The drawbridge buckled. For hours, smoke and shot roared across the stones of Saint-Antoine. By mid-afternoon, the outer walls gave way, and the people surged in, not organized, but undeniable. When the fortress surrendered, they pulled down its gates, and its keeper alike. Delaunay was dragged into the street. He was beaten, beheaded. His head lifted on a pike and carried through Paris like a signal flare. The violence was not strategy. It was momentum, sudden, brutal, absolute. The Bastille had housed just 7 prisoners. One was a noble lunatic. One claimed to be the heir of Caesar, but that wasn't the point. The building itself had been the cell, and now the cell was broken. Inside the shattered chambers they found dust, chains, torn ledgers, records of old accusations, names of the vanished. Some were burned, some were kept. The stones of the walls were chiseled loose and sold by the handful. Bastille keys were sent across oceans as gifts to men who spoke of liberty. In the cafes, they toasted its fall with red wine and thick bread. In the salons, even the most cautious noble leaned in to ask what would fall next. When word reached Versailles, the king asked if it was merely a riot. "Non, sire," came the reply. "C'est une révolution." That moment marked the pivot, not of policy, of reality. Power had left the court. It now marched through the streets on calloused feet, printed on handbills, spoken by the uninvited. The old centre could no longer hold, and perhaps it had never truly held at all. Elsewhere in the city, the symbols fell faster than orders could be drafted. Royal crests scraped off tavern signs, statues beheaded with hatchets, robes pulled from mannequins and used as barricade cloth. The tricolour ribbon appeared on lapels, on rifles, in window panes. What had been regal was now empty. What had been sacred, mocked. Even those who had once praised the king in verses now turned to pamphlets, sharp and unsigned. The Bastille was not stormed to rescue prisoners. It was stormed to prove they could. The kingdom had imagined itself eternal, and was undone by the hands of those who had been told to wait. The fall was not complete, but the spell was broken. The king still wore his crown. But no one looked up anymore. It was late when the night broke, not with cannon or cries, but with voices raised inside a chamber lined with gold. On August 4th, 1789, the deputies of the National Assembly stood, and one by one, began to dismantle the centuries. Titles were surrendered, dues renounced. A duke rose to abolish noble hunting rights. A bishop relinquished the tithe. A count declared that his privileges were a burden he no longer wished to bear. Some spoke with conviction, others with fear, many with calculation, but the result was the same. By sunrise, the foundation of old France had been voted out of existence. The mood was surreal, not triumphal, but disbelieving. In that hall, lit by candelabra and ghosts, the ancien régime was peeled back like old wallpaper. Layer after layer came undone: serfdom, feudal tolls, manorial courts, clerical immunities. What had once been considered eternal now cracked under the pressure of words. No peasant stormed the door, no army crossed the threshold. Yet the impact shook deeper than any riot. The privileges of birth, once worn like armor, had been shed in a single sitting. But revolution moves with echo. Beyond Versailles, the news raced on wheels and boots and ink. Across the provinces, in towns with names forgotten by Paris, people gathered in churches and town squares to read what had been written, that all men were born free and equal in rights, that sovereignty resided in the nation. That law would now speak with one voice. These were not merely declarations, they were detonations. The village blacksmith heard his children named as citizens. The tenant farmer saw the chain around his land dissolve in a line of printed text. In the countryside, fear moved as quickly as freedom. Rumors told of nobles fleeing with carts of gold, of brigands gathering in woods, of vengeance coming like smoke. In some places, manors were torched. In others, ledgers were burned with solemn ceremony, contracts reduced to ash as peasants looked on, silent. The night of August 4th did not erase inequality, but it undid its divine excuse. Hierarchy would no longer wear a halo. Weeks later, the Assembly passed the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, a text forged in ideal and fire. It bore 17 articles, sharp as scripture: liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. These were now the pillars. It did not abolish monarchy, but it redefined its perimeter. The king could still sit, but no longer above. He was now beneath the ceiling of law, crowned but circumscribed. In the salons, the parchment was read aloud like prophecy. In the cafes, it was debated line by line. In the printing houses, it was set in bold type and scattered like seed. Across the Atlantic, its echoes reached the ears of Thomas Jefferson and stirred uneasy admiration. In Vienna, it was called dangerous. In London, premature. In Paris, it was a beginning carved from the bones of habit. But no revolution moves cleanly. The old world, though wounded, still breathed. Nobles fled. Priests hesitated. The army listened, but did not yet kneel. And even within the assembly, doubt coiled like rope. What was freedom without bread? What was law without steel? Still, the words stood, and standing they divided time. Before them lay the long age of custom, after them a century that would be named for rights. And so the feudal night ended, not with a single sunrise, but with the spreading certainty that it would not return. The veil had been lifted, the past, broken into clauses and ash. The people were no longer subjects, they were citizens. And whatever came next, terror, war, glory, collapse, would stand upon a different ground. The king left in silence. At midnight on June 20th, 1791, Louis XVI stepped into a waiting carriage outside the Tuileries Palace, disguised in a brown coat and a round hat. His wife followed, veiled and pale, clutching her youngest child. The Dauphin's nurse carried the boy asleep. They said nothing as they passed the sentries. It had all been planned. The horses, the routes, the cover story. The king was fleeing his own people. He believed he would make it to Montmédy near the border where loyal regiments waited. From there, he might gather his strength, issue proclamations, retake the reins. But France was no longer a country he could traverse unnoticed. Postmasters recognized his face from coins. Soldiers questioned the royal livery on the carriage doors. The flight that had begun in velvet ended in dust. In Varennes, he was stopped. No confrontation, no fight, just a lantern lifted to a familiar face, and the sudden irreversible fall of illusion. They brought him back through towns lined with silence, no cheers, no prayers, only the clatter of hooves and the growing certainty that something had ended. In Paris, the assembly debated what to do. Some still clung to monarchy as principle. Others saw only betrayal. The king had sworn to serve the nation. He had fled it instead. A contract had been broken, and contracts once torn are not easily mended. For a time, they stalled. A constitutional monarchy was declared. Louis remained on the throne, but bound by parchment and parliament. He wore a crown, but it sat askew. He smiled, but fewer believed. The people had watched him run, and that memory clung harder than ceremony. Then came the war. Austria and Prussia threatened intervention. The monarchy became suspect. The Jacobins grew louder. The September massacres filled Paris with blood. And finally, in August of 1792, the palace was stormed. The monarchy was suspended. The Republic declared. Louis, once called the Well-Beloved, was now Citizen Capet. He was imprisoned with his family in the Temple, a cold stone tower with thick doors and no past. The trial began in December. The charges were many: conspiring with foreign powers, violating the will of the people, betraying the trust of the nation. He sat in a plain coat, his face heavy with fatigue. He denied none of the facts, only the interpretation. "I am innocent," he said, "of the crimes imputed to me." The convention voted. One by one, deputies rose to declare his fate. The verdict was death. On the morning of January 21st, 1793, the king rode in a cart through the frozen streets of Paris. No regalia or anthem, just the creak of wheels and the murmur of thousands. At Place de la Révolution, the scaffold stood ready. He climbed the steps with slow dignity, turned to speak. "I die innocent." His voice was lost in the drum roll. The blade fell, and the crown was gone. Some cheered, some wept. A few dipped cloth in the blood as relic. Others turned away. The world did not end, and the sky didn't darken, but something ancient had snapped. France had killed its king, and with him, an idea older than his language. What followed was neither peace nor certainty. The revolution would devour its makers. The guillotine would return. But this moment stood apart, not for its violence, but for its clarity. A line had been crossed that would never be uncrossed. The monarch had become mortal, the throne a memory. And whatever France would be now, it would always be a nation of questioning and challenging those in power. In the cold weeks after the king's execution, the throne in Versailles remained, empty, undraped, unclaimed. The gilded canopy still hung above it. The mirrors still caught the morning light. But the figure who had once animated it, the body, the voice, the ritual, was gone. And what remained was space, a kind of echo that never resolved. France had torn out its crown, but the wound did not close cleanly. In the countryside, church bells rang more softly. Some peasants knelt by habit, though the priest no longer named the king in prayer. In city cafes, revolutionaries raised glasses to liberty, but paused when asked what would follow. And in Paris, there were days when a passing shape, a carriage, a silhouette in white, made heads turn before reason caught up with memory. The Republic had no scepter and bore no sacred oil. It printed decrees in black ink and hung justice from beams, but it did not know how to sanctify what it created. The people were free and still starving. They were equal, and still suspicious. The guillotine had severed a head, but not yet bound a nation. The king was gone, but the habits of centuries clung like dust in the corners of old halls. And yet, something remained. The stones of France still stood. The cathedrals did not forget how to lift their spires. The bridges still crossed rivers that had witnessed coronations, crusades, and councils. In the shadowed aisles of Sainte-Chapelle, light still painted scripture on stone. In Rheims, pilgrims still passed beneath the arch where kings had once knelt. Versailles, stripped and silent, did not collapse. It waited, not for a monarch, but for meaning. Even in revolution there is continuity. The language of law, born of royal scribes, now served citizens. The names of kings lingered in streets, in churches, in songs. Children still played beneath statues that once crowned public squares. A throne may fall, but a kingdom does not vanish overnight. Its rhythm softens, its heartbeat slows, but its memory clings to the architecture, in arches, in avenues, in the curve of a gate where guards once bowed. Some wept for the loss, others cursed what had been. Most simply moved forward, because history, unlike myth, does not pause for mourning. France remained, but unmoored. The familiar anchors were gone. What came next would not be gentle. The years ahead would lurch with terror, foreign invasion, and the executioner's shadow. But in that space where one chapter closed and another had not yet begun, there was stillness, brief but whole. And then, footsteps. From the island of Corsica, a young officer rose, not with titles, but with maps and memory. He studied the revolution like terrain. He wore no crown, yet commanded loyalty deeper than blood. His name, when spoken, did not yet echo, but his presence moved like strategy, quiet at first, then undeniable. The revolution had shattered the throne, but not the desire for order, not the hunger for greatness. The kings were gone, but across Europe their heirs watched with trembling breath. From Vienna to Madrid, from St. Petersburg to London, they waited to see if the flames would cross the border, and in time they did. But not as riot, as legions. France would not return to its old monarchy. It would invent a new one, the kind born not of birthright, but of momentum. And when the temples were rebuilt, it would not be to crown a Bourbon. It would be to anoint an emperor, one who, in irony sharpened by history, would kneel before the Pope and rise wearing laurels that bore the weight of both Rome and Versailles. The crown had fallen, but the dream of mastery, of destiny shaped by one, would find new cloth, new banners, a new name. But that, dear listener, is for another night. And so the bells fall silent. The palace is empty. The voices of kings and cardinals, saints and rebels drift softly into the dusk, but they do not vanish. They settle, like dust on old stone, like breath on cold glass, into the hush of memory. The kingdom of France does not end. It lingers, in the tilt of a fleur-de-lis carved into forgotten wood, in the echo of footsteps across polished marble, in the weight of a story once whispered beneath vaulted ceilings. Perhaps, dear listener, you feel it now. That stillness, that sense that something vast and vanished has passed close. If you are still with us, thank you, truly, for your time, your presence, your patience. In a world full of noise and haste, you chose to be still, to listen, to remember. You have walked beside us through smoke-filled cathedrals and fields of ash, through golden halls and rain-darkened roads, through ritual, revolt, and the quiet places where history hides its face. This is not just the story of monarchs. It is the story of belief, in power, in permanence, in the hands that shape the world. So, let us part gently. Let the mirrors grow dim. Let the crown rest unclaimed beneath the heavy sky. The names, Louis, Richelieu, Joan, Antoinette, they may rest now, but they are never truly gone. They wait in tapestries faded by time, in manuscripts left open on ancient desks, in the hush that falls before a nation remembers who it once was. Sleep well now, and may your dreams be touched by cathedral light, by candle-lit halls, and by the quiet footsteps of history finding its way home.